mode.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for NCEA's webinar, Essentials of Core Reading Instruction, Grades 1 and 2, Assess, Analyze, and Instruct. I'm Andrea Kopp, Assistant Director of Professional Development with the National Catholic Educational Association, and I'm happy to be your host today. Before we begin, please know that your microphone connections have been muted. If you have questions during today's presentation, please send those through the question box that appears in your GoToWebinar control panel. To ask a question or share a comment, use your mouse to click into the blank box area, type your question using your keyboard, and then click Send. The webinar presentation will last about an hour, and you can post questions or comments throughout the presentation for our presenter tonight. Immediately following the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief survey about your experience, and we thank you in advance for providing us with this valuable feedback. For those of you who are attending the webinar live, you'll find a copy of the presentation materials and your certificate of attendance in the handout section of your GoToWebinar panel. You can download those at any time. You'll also receive an email tomorrow with instructions on accessing this recording. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Michelle Leah, Assistant Director of Professional Development for the Andrew M. Greeley Center for Catholic Education with Loyola University of Chicago. Welcome, Michelle. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm really excited to be here, and good evening, everyone. So we'll begin with a prayer, and this is from the Creighton Online Ministry. So let's start with the sign of our faith. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of infinite love, I thank you for this reminder of your love and your call that we be more patient, gentle, and compassionate with others. Here in the middle of Lent, I turn to you to beg for your help. Please soften my heart. Help me to let go of judging others. I ask you this in Jesus' name. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, hello. I wanted to start off by sharing some resources with you. If you go to this website, it will get you access to a Google folder that I've created that has some resources that are related to what we're doing tonight, some very specifically, and other information that was based on some questions from the previous webinar on the same topic. So you will find the PowerPoint for this presentation, which is also in your GoToWebinar control panel under the chat, and then, as I said, there are other resources. So as Andrea said, I am the Assistant Director for Professional Development at the Andrew Greeley Center at Loyola University in Chicago, and we do professional development, instructional coaching, as well as provide guidance around inclusive practices in Catholic education and Catholic school leadership. And you can find us on Twitter, and also we have a Facebook page, and here's that bit.ly again. I also wanted to direct you, there's some additional resources related to what we're talking about tonight at our website, which is luc.edu/GCCE. And if you go to over on the far right in the resources section, there are two newsletters that we in the center write, and it sort of sounds like the Wizard of Oz a little bit, or we are the Wizard of Oz. There aren't so many of us. There are about 6 of us in our office, and so we have a newsletter for that is meant for parents and families, but it's also helpful for teachers, which is has some resources in English and in Spanish. And then we also have the Faithful Reader, which is a newsletter that is meant for K-8 teachers that has some information about reading instruction, some book talks. There's always a picture book talk and a chapter book talk, or recommended books. And then I also want to make sure that I align what we're talking about to the national standards and benchmarks for effective Catholic elementary and secondary schools. And Standard 7, which is in relation to academic excellence, talks about an excellent Catholic school implementing effective instruction, and particularly Standard 7.3 talks about students becoming literate, which I know is kind of a literal attempt at what we're talking about tonight, but I think that it's important to include that alignment. So tonight we are talking about the essentials of core reading instruction, and that means trying to meet the needs of all readers. And I think that at the heart of reading instruction is assessment. And I know a lot of people cringe when they hear that because they think of testing, but the truth is that without assessment, I don't know what my students know or where they are, and then if I don't know that, then I can't move them on and help them to progress. So we're going to talk about 4 specific reading assessments tonight, and we're going to talk about generally how to administer them, what kind of information we'll glean from them, and and then how to analyze them. And then finally, some examples or ideas about what do I do with that information then? How do I, after I've analyzed the data, then how do I plan instruction and potentially plan intervention? And we'll have an example of a student who, after analysis, needs no intervention at all and actually needs enrichment. So let's start with a poll. The first poll of 3 tonight is about what sort of tools you use for your reading instruction. So Andrea is going to pop up the poll, and your choices are SuperKids, Reading Street, Journeys, using Scholastic or a leveled library, and then if you don't use any of those, the others, the choice. And while you're completing that, we're going to take a look at, just sort of dial back a bit and think about what is reading instruction. What are the essential components of reading? And I really like this image from Read Naturally because of the way that they have comprehension out here on the outside. So back in 2000, several reading researchers got together and decided to do a meta-analysis of the reading research. So you know that metacognition, from being reading teachers, means thinking about our own thinking. So meta-analysis was analyzing the research that already existed. So they didn't do new research in the year 2000 related to this, but they just analyzed what was already out there. And what they determined was these 5 things, they're sometimes referred to as the big 5, these 5 components are the essential components of reading instruction. And the reason I like this Read Naturally image is because we know as teachers of reading that comprehension is what it's all about. When we go to read, it's all about understanding what we read. And I know sometimes that's hard when you're teaching first and second graders and you're reading the leveled readers that are not exactly exciting some days because they are made intentionally for them to be decodable. But it's really important to remember that we don't just teach phonemic awareness, we don't just teach phonics, we have to teach it all, and students have to know that the most important thing about that is to understand. So before we move on, let's check in with the poll and see what the results were.
We had 11% of the audience say SuperKids, 22% said Reading Street, 44% said Journeys, 11% Scholastic or other leveled library readers, and 11% said other.
Wow, all right, thank you. So my reason for asking for that information is just to kind of get an idea of what resources you have. Before we move on any further, it's really important to note that what you have is great because you have it and you don't have to pay for something new right now. Chances are if you have a packaged basal series, then you also have an assessment kit that went with it. If you don't, I would maybe gently ask your principal if it's possible to get access to that. If you have that kind of material, those kind of materials, please use them. Don't feel like you have to use something that is packaged in a pretty way. The stuff that we're going to refer to tonight is all free with an exception of one that you can add on to, I guess. But whatever you have and whatever you're using that works for you and your students is the best assessment for you because you have it and it works for you. So before we talk about the very specific assessments, I want to talk a little bit about informal assessment. And I put assessment in quotes here because I want to make sure that we know that it doesn't always mean, I think when we think assessment, we think testing and then we think pencil and paper. And that's not necessarily the case. Some of the assessments we're going to talk about tonight, the students don't have any pencil and paper and you're marking down what they're saying. But we also have some opportunities, and preschool, kindergarten, first, second grade teachers are really good at this kind of assessment collecting and this kind of data collection because you're constantly taking notes, especially the younger your students are or the more emergent they are, the more chances that you are going to be taking notes like this because the less information you're going to be getting from them in writing. So something like this where you have your students' names over here on the side and then you can take notes each day of the week. This is helpful for reading behaviors, seeing the student being able to answer implicit or explicit questions, watching how they use their decoding or word attack skills. It's also, frankly, helpful for other kinds of behaviors if you're seeing repeated behaviors. So you may not want to have the days of the week listed. You may just want to have a place to take notes. Also know that this doesn't have to be fancy. It can have just students' first names, and then when you're writing notes over here, you can just use the student's initials or the number from over here. This was an idea that probably you've all used something like this, and each box was a post-it note. I was talking to a preschool teacher recently who this is how she collects her data. Obviously, preschool students don't really do paper pencil assessments really ever. And so her idea was she had post-it notes for each student, but she wasn't really sure how to then compile the data to make it usable. And so one of the things that she did was she started to include a box, and I know these aren't preschool standards, but I just wanted to give this as an example. She put a box on her data collection sheet or anecdotal note-taking sheet with a standard on it, so that all of her notes for that standard then would be, all the notes on this page would be in relation to that standard. And she found it, I saw her in February, and then I saw her again in March, and she said that it was really helpful to have some focused information. This is a way to collect data from individual students, or if you're meeting with students in small groups. Sometimes teachers ask, how do I collect data about informal or independent reading? And this is a way to do that. If you meet with students in one-on-one conferences, you could say that this, maybe you meet with 4 students a day, and then you put their names here and then some things that you take note of. Or you could meet with a group of students, put all of their names here, and then take note of some of the things that all of them are doing, so you would be looking for patterns. Data collection, data analysis is all about looking for patterns. And this is for more for older grade students, but certainly can be used for first and second grade students too. This is another way for you to take note of students' independent reading, and it's a way to, and the headings are explained down here. This is from Donalyn Miller, who wrote the book The Book Whisperer and Reading in the Wild, and this is a place for you to see how difficult students, the text the students are choosing, and then also it's a place for you to see, so this is for one reader, this is for another reader, so this is for 1, 2, 3, 4 readers total. But it's also a place for you to see if students are not maintaining stamina and they are abandoning books regularly. This is a way for you to keep track of it so that you can touch base with the student and help them make those decisions. So now we're going to talk about some specific assessments. We're going to talk about how to administer them. We're going to get to see what they look like. Then we're going to also talk about how do I analyze them and what kind of information do they give me. And then finally, and I think maybe most importantly, and what do I do with that information? Some schools are data-rich information poor. They're drip schools, and we don't want to be that way. We want to be data-rich and information-rich as well. Let's take another poll, though, before we keep going. So this poll, in the areas of the big 5, these 5 areas, in what area do you feel like your students struggle the most? So this time they're not in alphabetical order, but of these 5 areas, what area do you think your students struggle the most? So we're going to talk about these 4 assessments. And these 4 assessments are, as you see them, are all free. The only one that is not free, actually it is free, Words Their Way spelling inventory. If you want to do more than just give the spelling inventory and you want to use some of the tools included in that book, you'd have to buy the book, which is about $40. But we're going to start off with the letter identification assessment. Before we do that, though, let's check in with the poll results.
We had 80% of the audience indicate comprehension. Nobody said vocabulary. 10% indicated phonics. Nobody responded with phonemic awareness, and 10% indicated fluency.
Great. All right. Very helpful information. Thank you. All right. So we are going to talk about letter identification assessment. And this is one example of this. You may be familiar with the DIBELS assessment, which is Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills, abbreviated DIBELS, out of the University of Oregon. You might use that assessment. You might use Ames Web. You might use an assessment, again, from your Basel series. These are all fine. They're great. In Illinois, we have an Illinois snapshot of early literacy that is very similar. The goal for the letter identification is to determine what letters students know, obviously, and what they don't. I like this form that is given, that I found from Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, which is out of Teachers College in New York. I like that it gives you the letter and the sounds side by side that can help you to compare the information. I think sometimes when we are delving into figuring out why a student's struggling with reading, sometimes it comes down to that they don't know their letters and or their sounds. So this is helpful. The students would look at a document like this and they would do both uppercase and lowercase letters. And you can see that, that I changed the font between upper and lowercase because one of the things that really throws students off is the funny looking A and the funny looking G. I call it the typewriter G because that's what it looks like to me. The American typewriter font makes it look funny. So it's important that students have exposure to those different fonts, but when you're giving an assessment like this, I think it's helpful to have just a clean font. And this is Apple Casual if you're curious. So let's do some analysis. Let's take a look at two student examples. So if a student, you were administering this assessment to a student and she miscued or made mistakes on these 3 letters, take 3 seconds to think, what does that tell you about this student? So I see that this student has either not said the correct letter or has said the wrong, so either said nothing or said the wrong letter for Q, D, and G. So that tells me that this student is going to need some work with figuring out those letters. We know that B and D and Q and G are really tricky because they look a lot alike. And so this student just needs, maybe if I have guided reading for 13 minutes, maybe I end guided reading 1 or 2 days a week at the 11-minute mark, and I pull this student to the back. I have a very funny feeling, at least when I was a second grade teacher, a lot of my students needed this extra support, and when I was a reading specialist and worked with first graders, a lot of my students needed this support. So I'm going to teach them some tools like using the picture of a bed, which you can find in the Google Drive, and some other things like putting their fists together with their thumbs up so they know the B is their left hand and the D is their right hand. Those kinds of things can be helpful. But this is just, it's kind of like a quick, it's not a misunderstanding, but it's just something that students need a little bit of extra work with. Let's take a look at another student. So this student has not gotten any of the first letters correct in this assessment. And so that, for most letter identification assessments, this is a sign that I need to stop the test because I'm not going to go on anymore. If they don't know the first 5, then they probably don't know anymore. The only way that I will break this rule is if I know that the student's name is Zach. I might go over here and see if he knows the first letter of his own name. Otherwise, I'm going to disband this assessment and take note of that. So this is a student that's going to need some work with their letters. He or she does not know his letters. So what am I going to do for that student? I'm probably going to start with flashcards. And for me, the first thing that's probably easiest, it's probably not the most fun, but the first thing would be flashcards just made out of note cards or cutting up a piece of paper and putting it on a ring or putting it in a Ziploc baggie. This is a great way to help parents to know how to help with this. We know, and we'll talk about this sort of throughout this webinar, we know that I have never met a parent who doesn't want to help his child or her child, but I have met many parents who don't know how to help their children. And so this is an example when parents come to you at parent conferences and you share this data with them that their child is really struggling with letter identification, and they say, how do I help my child? You can hand them a Ziploc bag with some letters in it. Or you can say, here's a Ziploc bag, here are some note cards. Ask your child to write 1 letter per card and then put them in a Ziploc bag, and you guys can do that as a game. You can spend 5 minutes, set your phone timer, or set your microwave timer to work on that. If you have access to technology, Google Slides is really fun for letter identification and for things like sight words, because you can create, put 1 letter per slide and then run it as a slideshow, and then the student practices 1 letter per slide. And I think you can time it so it waits 3 seconds or 5 seconds. Another thing for helping students with letter identification, as well as you can do this for sounds and for sight words, is doing a read aloud with just a small group. I just read an article about this on Twitter too. I always think of read alouds as with the whole group, but if you know that students are struggling particularly with letter identification, then maybe you're going to pick a book like Hop on Pop, and every time you see the letter H or see the letter P, you're going to point it out. And it's always use a fun pointer if you're going to do that. Same thing with if you have your room labeled or you have a big book, have the student pick one of the letters out of his Ziploc baggie of flashcard letters and then use the pointer to go through and point to that letter throughout. And then we know how important free reading is. Exposure to letters doesn't mean automatically that they are going to become familiar with those letters, but it certainly doesn't hurt. Our next assessment is the YAPSing, the phonemic segmentation, and you probably have in your assessment kit, if you have one, access to a phonemic segmentation assessment, but this is another tool for your toolkit. So for this assessment, you are determining whether students can chop or chunk words into their own phonemes. A phoneme is each individual sound. So this assessment up here gives you the directions of how you're going to bring this to the child. The child doesn't need anything for this, just his brain. So you're going to sit, I would say sit across from the child so that the child can see your mouth. One of the things that you could determine from an assessment like this is whether a child is struggling physically with his or her hearing. So we want to make sure that they can see your mouth, and we don't want that to be a factor. So you go through and give your directions and explain that you want them to tell the sounds in order and give an example. So if I say old, you should say o, old. If you use language in your classroom and you say things like, excuse me, chunk or chop or tapping out sounds, I would use that language in the directions, because I think telling each sound in order, honestly, to me, most kids don't really understand that. So if you use language in your classroom, use what you use in your classroom. So then what you'll do is you'll read the word, you'll say dog, and then you'll ask the child, can you tell me each sound in order, or can you chop this word? So how that's going to sound, if the child's doing it correctly, is the child is going to say d, a, g, k, e, I, n. Notice we're just hearing sounds, so the child is just going to give the sounds. They're not spelling the word. One thing we want to keep track of on here is we want to make sure that students are cutting their sounds or clipping their sounds. We don't want any extra sounds. So when I say the word keep, I want the students to just say k and not ka. I hear it sometimes in kindergarten classrooms, actually in other classrooms too, where the teacher is not encouraging, but she's not discouraging that extra It becomes a problem when the child begins spelling, because if I'm going to spell keep ka, e, pa, it's going to look a lot different than k, e, p. So I always tell the students to take their first and second fingers, or pointer and middle fingers, and make it look like a make-believe scissors, and cut their sounds at k, p, d. We want to keep them really tight. So this is going to give me some information very early on in this assessment, and you may even find that you only have to go through number 10 or a number 11 for this. If a student is really struggling, feel free to stop. You don't need to do the whole assessment, but you're going to get some really good information about whether they know their sounds, about whether they can chop or chunk their sounds. Sometimes you'll get a student who they will just stretch the word out, dog, and that's not enough. You really want to hear each sound, the g. So as I'm analyzing this information, these are the things I might discover about that child, that the child doesn't know his sounds, or she doesn't understand how to segment or chop or cut words out. It might all cut words up. It might also, as I said, give you an indication of whether the child can hear. If you're saying keep and the child is responding with beep because they heard beep instead of keep, that means that there might be something wrong with their hearing, and that might be a result of having tubes or not, or just some being challenged by hearing. So that's something that you want to take note of, date and year, and let that information, pass that information on to parents. Same thing, this is an assessment because you're one-on-one with a student. As with any one-on-one assessment, you might hear some speech articulation concerns. And honestly, we know that certain sounds don't come in for students until the end of second grade. We know that the R sound, for example, doesn't come in until the end of second grade. But you want to just keep an eye on those things, because we want to make sure that parents know about that if they can get some interventions for speech. So when I know information about students and their struggles with phonemic segmentation, one of the things I might do is use something like Michael Haggerty's Phonemic Awareness. And I've put pictures of his books over here on the right. The purple book is the pre-kindergarten book, the blue book is the kindergarten book, and the yellow book is the primary book. So the yellow book is meant for first and second grade teachers. Normally how that's handled is the first grade teacher uses the yellow book starting on the first week, and the second grade teacher starts with the middle of the book, same yellow book. And this is a book that is, the students sit on the carpet, and the teacher does this for 7 minutes. I feel like the Haggerty Phonemic Awareness is sort of like the infomercial. You can't quite believe how effective it is. It's cheap. The books are about $60, and you could easily share the yellow book if you needed to, or share with coworkers and just do it at different times of day, but it's not consumable, and so it'll last forever. So it's relatively cheap. It takes about 7 to 10 minutes a day. Once you get going on it and you've practiced, you can get it down to 7 minutes. You can use it with your whole class. You could use it with small groups if students need extra support, or you could use it one-on-one for students who are more in the Tier 3 needing support. It asks students to segment words, to substitute, omit, all kinds of different manipulations with their phonemes. So the kids come back to the carpet or the rug with you and they don't have anything in their hands. You can even turn the lights out if you want and just use a flashlight for yourself so you can see, because they are just listening and manipulating sounds. Another opportunity, and I know these are all things that you all know, but if you're doing whole class writing, you're at your easel or your smartboard, make sure that you model and explain out loud how you figure out how to spell words. So if you're about to spell the word hop, then say, I'm going to chunk this word, or I'm going to chop this word, or I'm going to tap this word. And then be really very blatant about how you do that. I'm going to chop hop. I hear the sound. And then which vowel makes the sound? That's the O. I'm going to write the O. So you kind of go through really slowly and model how you expect the students to do it. And whatever language works for you, I kind of mix it up, so I use the different words. Tapping is a system that's used with certain programs that are specific for children with reading disabilities, and it's very tactile. So you can start off just touching your thumb with your pointer finger and touching each time you say a sound. So if you were doing keep, you would tap that 3 times. E. So now we're going to talk about the Words Their Way primary spelling inventory. Words Their Way, you've probably seen this book or some iteration of it somewhere in your school. It's a super helpful book for grades K through at least 8, so that makes it reasonably priced at $40 if you're going to share a book with your schoolmates. This is what I mentioned before. The spelling inventory is free, but because it's available many places online. But if you want more resources, which I'm going to share some examples, then you can find those online. There are 3 spelling inventories in the book. There is the primary spelling inventory, which you're seeing here, of 26 words. There's also an elementary spelling inventory and an upper spelling inventory. So if you have a 2nd grader or a 1st grader who is an excellent speller and they get 100% on this spelling list, you may take the option of administering the elementary spelling inventory too. So this is all just for information gathering. So the way that this is administered is this is the only assessment of the 4 we're talking about today that you can administer to a whole class at the same time. It's administered the same way you administer a spelling test. So students get a document something like this, and they obviously write their name at the top, they write the date, and then you're going to read the words. You're going to read the way I do it is I read the word, I say fan. I could use a fan on a hot day. Fan. So I read the word in a sentence, and I read the word again. I assure the students at the beginning of the assessment that first and foremost, this is not graded and it is not going on their report card, and the only people that are going to see it are going to be me and the student and maybe parents at parent conferences, but the main purpose of this assessment is that it is a way for you to figure out how all the good things they do with their spelling and some areas that they might need some extra help with when it comes to spelling. So, and that is true. You are not going to be returning this test to them. They will never take it home with them because we don't want students to study for this. We want them to learn and be able to apply the patterns that are found within that. So students take the test and we get results like this. So what I would like for you to do right now is take 3 seconds and look over this student's test. This was given in January. So they've been in, this is a 1st grader in January. So take 3 seconds. What do you notice about this student? So this is a 1st grader, and he is in, like I said, it's January. He's been in school since the beginning of the school year. I noticed that he did a great job with fan, pet, and dig, but when it came to Rob, he had a hard time. On this spelling assessment, reversals don't count, so if he had written R-O-D, it would have been correct, but he's not sure about his spelling patterns. He was able to write hope correctly, but then wait, gum, sled, I see some vowel issues. So my first intervention or work with this student would be I would put him in a group where I knew we were going to be working on short vowels. That's something else when it comes to analysis. I'm looking for patterns. I'm looking for patterns within this student's work. What do I notice? I see good patterns here, but then the wheels sort of fall off with his short vowels here. The other pattern, though, that I'm looking at is I'm looking class-wide. So I'm just going to skip for a second to this document. I eventually may decide that I'm going to write my list of students. I can make 2 copies if I have more than 25 students. Is figure out who else is having trouble with beginning consonants, who else is having trouble with short vowels. And then I'm not providing individual interventions if I need to. I can just provide small group interventions. So let's take a look at another student. Same class, this is first grade, just taken in January. Take 3 seconds. What do you notice about this student? I noticed that this student is a pretty darn good speller. She's a first grader and she did an excellent job. A lot of times when I look at this assessment, I look down this column and just take note at if there's any glaring errors. And in hers, there are no errors, so they can't even be glaring. And over here, where things start to get a little bit more difficult, I would say that these are more like second grade spelling patterns. This word is supposed to be chewed, like I chewed my food well, and she has a phonetic spelling of that, so she did a good job. It's not correct, but she's in the right direction that she can hear the sounds. Adding an E to thorn is an easy fix. Growl, she put an A instead of an O, which makes sense because those vowel patterns can be tricky, and then not having the extra P in clapping. So this is a student who does not need an intervention. She just needs to keep on practicing her spelling as a first grader and keep, sponging and learning all the spelling that she needs to. She doesn't need an intervention at this time. Each one of the spelling inventories, and you can see this is from the elementary inventory, but each one of the spelling inventories has a document like this that you can fill out for each of your students. I will confess that it is quite time-consuming, but it is extraordinarily helpful. It tells you for each of the because on this document you notice that there are only 7 beginning consonants that count, so to speak, only 7 final consonants that count. And so this is where you see which ones of the consonants that count and what contributes to that total. This really gives you some helpful information where the wheels fall off, so to speak, and then which pattern the student might need some support in. And the Words Their Way company provides individual books for each of these spelling stages that give additional supports for you. Obviously they cost more, but it's just, this is a very helpful document. And seeing your class as a whole is very helpful as well, so that you can group students based on their needs. So some takeaways for my instruction for spelling and phonics is to make sure that I teach the patterns and spelling and I don't just assign them. I know that when I was a second grade teacher, I had a basal series that I was required to use, and in it there was, it included spelling, as basal series often do. Basal series often have way too many fantastic resources. And the spelling lists were made up of a list of very unique words and were not by pattern. And that was very difficult, and I ended up having to make adjustments and completely change the spelling, because when we teach first and second grade, we need to teach patterns so that students can start to apply what they know and what they're learning, and that they start to recognize those patterns, and that they can extrapolate and say, if I know how to spell, your word families, if I know how to spell cat, hat, and mat, then I can probably spell splat. I could just need to apply what I already know. And then any chances, with first and second graders, period, but any chances I can make the spelling and the phonics more hands-on, that's going to be helpful. So I'm going to show you some examples of word sorts in a second, and then we know how wonderful dry erase boards can be. A classroom that I visit regularly uses, she uses the Daily 5, so she uses the Scholastic Levels readers and for Daily 5, and she has her students pair up during their word study or working on words for Daily 5, and they use their dry erase boards to spell their spelling words, because the different groups have different spelling lists based on their needs, based on the information she gleaned from the Words Their Way assessment. So there are 2 examples here of some word sorts, and these examples are in the Google folder that you can access from that bit.ly. So one example, this is obviously going to be a little bit trickier. The way that I hand created this, because I wanted to do it based on the need of the group that I had. So when I make the word sort in Microsoft Word, I obviously just made a table. I include the sorts at the top, but then when I give it to the students, I cut this part, I cut that part off. And for the first sort, because the first sort I usually have them do an open sort where they're going to cut these out and then they're going to figure out which words go together. So what sometimes happens is they'll make a pile of words that start with S and a pile of words that start with B, and then they start to realize that they have too many piles. So I might, after a couple, like a minute or two, them and say, let's see, do you see any words that have ER in the middle, like serve? Let's see, let's put serve up at the top and see if we can make a pile of those words. So the students have to cut those out. Here's another example of some word sorts. And you see that these lists are pretty long. You might decide if you're differentiating for students, you may only use half, or you may only use CDC words to begin with. Absolutely, you have the power, so you can do whatever you want with that. So what students are going to do to sort this, and I know that these are higher level words, but I wanted to give you a picture, so a literal picture of what you could see. So students are going to put sort of the flagship word at the top, and then they're going to make their list or their pile, quote unquote, using that word at the top, so they can divide them that way. And I put this in the Google folder. You can access from the bit.ly as well. This is adapted from Wilson Reading, which is for working with students who need serious reading interventions. This is a way to just get students to do some practice that's very focused on the needs that they have, that after you do an assessment, you can do something like this. So in this case, I would say, write down the letter that makes the eh sound. Or if you have second graders, you could say, write down the letter that makes eh or e. Write the letter that makes a, or write the letter that makes a or a. Write the two letters that work together to make the or the sound. Write the two letters that work together to make the ch sound, and so on. So then I wouldn't do nonsense words the first time you do this. So then I would have the students write a word up here on this line, and I would say, I want you to write the word chap, C-H-A-P, chap. And then I would say, I'm going to give you 5 words to spell. All of the words in this list are going to start with ch, just like chap does. So this is sort of like a reverse word family. We're not looking at the end of the word, at the rhyme, R-I-M-E of the word. We're looking at the beginning of the word, which is something that we really, as first and second grade teachers and teachers of reading in general, we really need to do that so that we're focusing on all parts of the word. And then if you choose, you can do some of the word sentence dictation at the bottom that uses the words that you used up here. I like this because it gives you another opportunity to point out, don't forget your capital letter at the beginning and your end mark at the end of the sentence. Our last assessment tonight that we're going to talk about is a running record. And a running record can use any text. If you have a Fontes and Pinnell benchmarking system, you can certainly use that. If you use Dibbles or AimsWeb, you have access to progress monitoring tools. But if you don't have any of those things, here are some tools that have some free things on them. So Reading A to Z, or RAS Kids, has several free resources there. There is a cost if you want to have a membership, and if you do that, I recommend that you pair up with some other people at your school because you can get a school membership. But readworks.org is free. It doesn't have a lot of resources for first and second grade students or readers, but and then this link as well, readingandwritingproject.org, is the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, which is the Lucy Calkins people. There are several free texts on that website that you can access to. But just to reiterate, you don't need to have a running record to do a running record. You can do it using any text. So this is a free download I got from the Sadlier company. And so I'm going to show you how you could use this if you wanted to do a running record. So if you were studying animals, or you were studying in your life science time, or you were studying animal adaptations, then this is an article you might read with your class anyway. So why not make it a running record? So the first thing I just wanted to point out really quickly is that the genre of this article is actually not a magazine article. It's an informational text, which is under the umbrella of nonfiction. I generally just call it nonfiction, but it happens to be a magazine article, but that's not its genre. I just wanted to point that out as we were reading this. So what I've done here is I just took this existing text and I counted how many words were in each line, and then it's cumulative. And then I'm going to ask the student to read it out loud for me. When I do this, I ask the student to a couple of things. I kind of have a little mantra when we do this. When we read out, when the student reads out loud to me, I always ask them if they want a bookmark or something to track so that they only see one line at a time. And to be honest, that's often a folded Post-it note or a folded piece of paper, whatever I have on my guided reading table. And then I point to the title and I say, you are going to read At Home in a Cave. I read that out loud to them. And then I say, I'm going to ask you to read this text out loud for me. I want you to remember to read just like you talk, so not too fast and not too slow. And while you're reading, I want you to make sure that you're thinking, because when you're finished, I'm going to ask you some questions about what you read. I say that every time I have students read anything out loud to me. Then what I do is then I say, when you're ready, you can start reading, and you're going to read this word first. And then when I have them start reading, I always time students. So I have my phone near me with my the clock app open with the timer or the stopwatch. And if a student looks like they think I'm trying to time them so that they can go fast, I always say, I'm just doing this so that I can keep us on track so I can get to the next student. It's a white lie. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I think it's helpful to have students be timed, because then it gives me some indication of how they're measuring up to national norms and what kind of interventions I might need. I make a mark where they are at a minute. So let's say they got to this point. I make a mark at a minute. And then I can have them keep reading until the end of the page. It depends on how much time I have, which no teacher has extra time. But if I really want to keep hearing them read it, it can be helpful to keep doing that. So let's take a look. This is one student, and this student is reading this. What sort of things do you notice about what the student's errors? So take 3 seconds to do a quick analysis of these 4 words that they miscued on. What do you notice? What I notice is that the 4 words that they've miscued on, or the mistakes that they've made, they're all sight words. They're word wall words. So that means that this student needs some extra support with word wall words or sight words. So this is another case where I might have a Ziploc bag with some words for that student to practice. I might cross-reference or triangulate if they're having the same struggles with those words in other classes, or maybe it's just in this text kind of threw them off. So they might just need some extra support with the word wall words or the sight words. Let's look at this, let's look at this student. Take 3 seconds and analyze, what do you notice about the errors that this student has made? I notice that this student has made errors. 4 of the 5 errors are magic E words, or words that have a CVCE pattern. So in all of these words, the E jumps back, to make the vowel say its name. And then in this 5th word, it's another long vowel pattern. So this student, the pattern that I'm seeing and when I analyze this student data is that the student needs some support with long vowel patterns. Now this student might not need extra support. It might be that the whole class needs this kind of support. If I have a class of 25, maybe 20 students need this support. So I need to do a mini lesson with the whole class and keep on that skill with everyone. Or I may notice that only 5 students need that support, in which case it needs to be a mini lesson at the back table, at my guided reading table. All right, let's take another poll. When you're trying to assess students, we've been talking a lot about that, what's tricky? Assessment is never easy. So is it tricky to find time? Is it tricky to find ways to keep the rest of the class engaged? Or is it tricky to find assessment materials? So while you're doing the poll, I'm just going to share a lesson plan template. Not that I'm expecting you to use it, because I know that it's kind of lengthy, but one of the things that I like about this is I like to be able to pull out exactly, it's a reminder for me to differentiate. So if I just have reading, what's my objective, and I don't have any of these boxes over here, I might be tempted to teach my whole class reading all the time. If you teach your whole class reading, if you teach reading to your whole class only, and you never meet with small groups and you never meet with individuals, you are not going to meet the needs of all of your students. It's not possible. At some point during your reading instruction, you have to meet with small groups, preferably based on the data you glean from assessment data, or you have to meet with individuals. Meeting with individuals is very time consuming. It's also very helpful, but it's very time consuming. So if I can have 3 groups, some teachers have as many as 5 or 6 groups. I find that to be hard management-wise personally, but it depends on how many kids you have and what class you have. so each group has approximately 5 to 8 students in it, then that's actually, I should say, about 5 students in it. So you're going to have probably 4 or 5 groups. Figuring out what do these groups need. So when I gave running records to my whole class, and I did that individually, I had these 6 students who were really struggling with this comprehension strategy. You know, most students that really struggle, honestly, with summarizing and main idea. So, excuse me, that is information that I use to figure out what sort of instruction this group needs. Maybe this group is just right on track for what the grade level expectations are, but they are also working on main idea, and I'm just trying to get them to go from where they are now to where they need to be. And then this group doesn't struggle at all, but they might be reading more difficult texts in order, their level texts are more difficult, and I'm going to ask them to identify the main idea as well. Thank you for the poll results. So 67% find ways to keep the rest of the class engaged as challenging. Absolutely. 0% have trouble finding time, which is great. 22% finding assessment materials. I think that when it comes to finding ways to keep the class engaged, I always look to Chapter 1 of the book, The Daily 5, which is written by the 2 sisters. I find this to be very helpful to help students gain stamina and endurance, be able to silently read, which by this time of the year, I know your students are all pros at that. But giving them something to do that's really authentic and has an authentic literacy activity is really important. So something like silent reading or spelling their spelling words or doing a word sort, those kinds of things are really helpful and important. Listening to reading at this grade level, these grade levels too, is helpful. So a couple of things that I just wanted to say about when you do administer assessments is to make sure that you keep the date and you write the year as well. You want to make sure that as you're keeping this data, you might have students who have left you and they're in 4th or 5th grade, and the 4th or 5th grade teacher comes to ask you a question about them, and if you still have that data, it's helpful that you have the year so that you know which Mary or which Joseph you're talking about. Another thing that's really important is that when you give assessments, you want to make sure that you don't just write down and save the score, but that you keep the actual protocol. So when we were talking about running records and we have the picture of the bears, you have what words they got wrong and not just what their percentage was, because the percentage doesn't help me. Those students both got almost the same score, but their miscues were very different. So I want to know what mistakes they made, not just how many mistakes they made. All right. Does anybody have any questions about assessment or anything else?
We do have a few questions that have come in, and feel free to keep posting if you've not gotten a chance to submit your question yet. One of our attendees would like to know how you encourage reluctant readers or those who want to stay in their comfort zone.
Good question. I think that there's a book for every child. You just have to find the right book. So one of the things that I liked to do as a classroom teacher was when we would go to the library, if your school has a library, to sort of talk and have a conversation with the child and get to know what they like, and then sort of help to guide them, sort of like a goodreads.org, which is for adults, but if the student likes it, what other books might that child like? So maybe Amelia Bedelia books or something else, like Fancy Nancy. You know, sort of find a book, and series books are great if you can get students to like that, because then they're drawn in and they want to read the whole series.
Okay, another question asked, with running record after timing and errors, how do you calculate without an F&P calculator?
Time and error. So that is a great question. When you figure out how many words they read correctly in a minute, and then you're going to figure out, so it's going to be the number, actually this is in the Google folder too, so it's going to be the number of words that they read is going to be your denominator, and the number of, let me see if I'm doing this right. The number of words total in that minute's time that they read is at the bottom, and the number of words that they read correctly is the numerator. So the numerator is the number of words read correctly, and the denominator is the number of words total. That's how you figure out their words per minute, their reading rate. Reading rate is words per minute.
Thanks. And how can someone use data to conference with parents who feel their child should be performing at a higher reading level in class based on what they read at home?
Excellent question. I call this the Harry Potter syndrome, where the parents say, well, he's reading Harry Potter at home. I don't know why he's only reading a level I in school. I think that this data is where it's at for this. So you want to have as many pieces of data to share with the parents to show them exactly what the child's actual performance is in school. So this is why you keep, one of the other reasons why you keep that protocol from when you did the running record. So let's say you have a second grader who is maybe reading at a level I or J, which is really an end of first grade level. So you want to show the parent how the child did on the I level with a running record, how the child did on a J, and show the errors that they're making, show them how long it's taking them to read. So on this passage, the child read 49 words per minute, and then the more difficult passage, the child only read 40 words per minute. So sort of showing them how the child actually performs when they do these kinds of assessments. You may also, depending on what you learn from the running record, you may also want to have some additional assessment data. So for example, if a student struggles with a level I or J passage, as we did today, what did you find out when you analyzed this? Are they struggling with sight words? So then give them an assessment and see how many sight words they know. Are they struggling with long vowel patterns? Show them the words their way spelling assessment. So to me, a parent conference is all about sort of laying out graphs and charts to show exactly what the student is doing in comparison to what the child did previously that school year, but also to show how the child is doing compared to others nationally. In the Google folder that you can access through that bit.ly link, there is a document called the Hasbrook and Tyndall. It's an oral reading fluency norms, which is the national norms from the United States, obviously, for grades 1st through 8th for reading fluency. And that can give you some information in addition to some of the other data that you have.
We have a question about assessing independent reading. What type of patterns should teachers be looking for?
With independent reading, you want to be watching that the student is sustaining or having stamina while reading. So let's say that you have 10 minutes of silent reading, which I think is appropriate for first grade. They can probably do more than that, but it's a good start. So if during that 10 minutes, if the student is standing in the classroom library the whole time book shopping, then they're not reading. If the child is fake reading, which you can usually suss out by seeing that they're not turning any pages or they're turning pages too quickly. So some of this is behavioral. You want to be seeing what's going on. Usually that's a sign. Those two things, book shopping and fake reading, are usually a sign of a couple of things. It's a sign of that reluctant reader who they don't want to read this book because it's not right for them, or it's a sign that the book the student chose is too hard. Especially I notice this in classrooms where students start to read chapter books, and sometimes students who aren't ready for chapter books are, really decide they really want to read a chapter book even though they're not ready for it yet. So they find themselves picking a book that they absolutely cannot read. So those, informally, I think those are some of the things that I would look for. One of the things I should have mentioned earlier about reluctant readers, I think one of the things that is most helpful, most important about supporting readers in general is learning about them as readers, what they like and what they don't like. And this could be gleaned at the very beginning of the year or any time of year using a reading survey. What kind of books do you like to read? How do you feel about reading at home? There's an old school survey, the Garfield reading survey, that has students talk about how I feel when I go to the library, or how I feel when I go to the bookstore, or how I feel when I get to read a book of my choice in school. So really getting to know what your kids like and what they like to read, and making sure you provide time in school for them to read whatever they want. And I know nobody likes Diary of a Wimpy Kid or Captain Underpants, but kids love those books. So making sure that they get to read anything obviously appropriate, but those books are just silly. They're not totally inappropriate.
And one final question before we wrap up. Do you have any tips or strategies that work particularly well for English language learners?
I love English language learners because they bring such richness to our classrooms. They often speak many more languages than I do. The tips that I have for students who are learning English would be the number one, which is helpful for the whole class, is visuals. So when you're working with students and you have a new vocabulary word or you're starting a new book, make sure you have a visual. Google Images is your best friend. So if you're starting a new book and there's a vocabulary word like mountain or something like that, find a picture of it and point it out. If there are students in your class who both speak the same language, make sure they get to sit near each other or at least near each other when you need them to talk, because it would be helpful for them to be able to translate and sort of rehearse in their native language first and then be able to talk out loud in English if they're ready to do that yet. Being able to, that free choice reading is helpful for everybody. Making sure that the students have plenty of, this is for all students, but English language learners also, that they have plenty of time for practice and at-bats, so that if there's a new skill or strategy that you want them to be successful using, don't assume if you teach it on Monday that they're going to be ready to apply it on Tuesday. They're going to need lots of time and lots of time to do that in a very low stress, low stakes kind of way. So we don't want to teach something on Monday and then give it a test or a quiz on it on Tuesday, or they may not even be ready for it on Friday. They need lots of practice.
Well, we are almost at the hour. I want to thank you, Michelle, for all of your expertise. It's been a fantastic webinar with great resources that are shared. And I want to remind the audience I will be sending this out to you via email tomorrow, the recording, the certificate of attendance, and all the presentation materials. So look for that email within 24 hours. Before we conclude, Michelle, did you want to let our members know about some of the upcoming NCEA events where you'll be presenting and give us any final thoughts?
Yes, I'm going to be presenting at NCEA in St. Louis. My session is called Empathy and Inclusion Through Literature. So it's basically going to be an hour of me talking about books. I'm going to have several books that have the covers there, and I will kind of give little book talks about them, and they will all be books that are related to being empathetic and including students of all different kinds. And the other learners conference this summer, I'm going to be talking about reading interventions, so sort of what we talked about today, honestly, but with some more detail. And before I go, I just wanted to say two other quick resources that I learned about. One I learned about today, but if you have access to PBS, or I'm sure it's on YouTube, there's a program called Read Between the Lions, L-I-O-N-S, which has some great short videos, like When Two Vowels Go Walking, the first one does the talking. Kids love it, and they're short, and you can use them in small group or whole group. And then also Letter Factory, which you can access on YouTube as well. So thank you all very much for taking time this evening, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your Lent and a lovely Easter.
Yes, thank you, and thanks to the audience for all your great questions and participation. I invite you to visit our website at ncea.org to see listings for upcoming webinars. We will feature Michelle again this academic year, as well as links to register for our professional development activities like the Exceptional Learners Conference and, of course, our NCEA convention in St. Louis, which is just coming up in a few weeks. I will be sending you all the materials tomorrow. I thank you for your time and wish you a blessed evening.